So good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. Part of Earth Laws Month for our session called Medium Expectations. How can we demand less from the living world? What I'm going to do is just open up with an acknowledgement of country and a reminder of the context within which we are speaking this evening. So tonight's discussion in our webinar is part of Earth Laws Month. And Earth Laws Month is an initiative by AILA where we're gone a little bit crazy, and we're hosting, apparently we've reached 35 events in September, a whole range of wonderful webinars where we're inviting all of our friends and colleagues that we work with to share information, updates, webinar formats on Indigenous knowledge systems, science, law, economics, education, ethics, and the arts. Tonight's session is a joyful mix of ideas from the week we've been co-hosting with Nina, Economics for the Earth. We've had some marvelous conversations, which I can talk about throughout the evening tonight, and also co-hosted by Future Dreaming. So tonight is all about Indigenous and non-Indigenous perspectives on the cultural aspects, the human and the social and the interacting aspects of how we can reduce demands on the living world and create, for want of a better term, an ecological society. I'd like to acknowledge country. I'd like to acknowledge that I live, work and play on the beautiful lands of the Yagara and Turrbal peoples. This lovely photo is of some water lilies at the Nudgee Nunda, or the Black Duck waterholes that I live nearby. So I'd like to acknowledge elders past, present and young leaders emerging now. I'd like to acknowledge the civilizational culture that has cared for country and cared for kin since time immemorial. And as I always do within the work that we do within AILA and Nina and Future Dreaming, as a non-Indigenous person, I'd like to also acknowledge the ongoing impacts and legacy of colonisation. And a lot of the work that we look at is how we can move forward into a brighter future where First Peoples have the respect, sovereignty and self-determination that they already have but want more, and how they can care for country and how we can all work together to build a much more compassionate, sensible and earth-centered society. So tonight in our talk, normally I would invite Mary Graham, the proper way to invite an elder to speak first, and then Ross Williams, but we're actually turning it around tonight. I'm going to speak first and give some non-Indigenous perspectives, really to set the scene about some of the issues that we think about, how we've taken so much from our beautiful planet, and what can we do about it. So in a moment, I'm going to give a fairly general, big picture introduction to how are we going to rethink our expectations and demands. And then we'll hand over to Mary Graham to give some perspectives of her own, including the really wonderful, what I think of as a guiding framework and a deep philosophical approach that's worth understanding and really starting to follow, which is the relationist ethos. And then last but definitely not least, the wonderful Ross Williams will share some of his perspectives as a Bindal Juru man. I'm going to let Mary and Ross introduce themselves when they start their talks. I think they can explain who they are in a much richer fashion than I can. So, this is my invitation to all of you to, if you wish, pop into the chat where you are, whose country you're on, what you're up to today. It's always nice in a Zoom link to try to connect with you a little bit, and by telling us where you are and what you're up to in the chat, it's a nice way to see everybody. So I'm now going to start with my introductory scene setting. And I love this cartoon. For those who don't know much about me, I actually did a PhD on how and if we could use Western law and regulatory structures to reduce consumption, unsustainable consumption. And during that process, I ended up with a lot of cool cartoons, including this one. I think it's very appropriate when we think about medium expectations and how can we demand less from the living world. And a core element of a lot of the work that we do inside AILA and also inside Future Dreaming is talking about culture. Inside AILA, which is a largely non-Indigenous created, but Indigenous and non-Indigenous led group, we talk about the cultural aspects of Western industrialised society. And I'll touch on a few of those issues that we think about in a moment. So in my short talk, I'm going to briefly touch on the current ecological crisis, the causes and the symptoms, and a little bit about how did we get here, because the how did we get here touches on the history of my people, the folks who moved from Europe into other places and colonized most of the planet, and brought with them certain ideas about extraction and expansionism, and really created the culture that has created the overshoot. And what we can do about it, so many different things we could talk about, but I'm going to touch on a couple of ideas and connect it to a really, I think, a very important article that I read years ago when I was doing my PhD, The Gospel of Consumption, and how it tells an important story of corporate creation of the ecological crisis through overproduction and overconsumption, but some very interesting ways that we can think differently about what could be done. So, because I know folks joining up to this call are already very interested in the kinds of issues we've been talking about all week and will be talking about all month, Earth-centered governance, I don't have to talk about the crisis that we face, but it is worth remembering that climate change, biodiversity loss, degraded ecosystems, poor water quality, people starving, people getting flooded in those big storms, welcome to the Anthropocene, all of this is a symptom. These are not the causes. This is the impact on the living world of what humanity has been up to over the last, well, we'll talk about that. How long have we been degrading these systems? So the current ecological crisis is manifesting itself in many terrible indications and symptoms. And just a reminder, folks, to do stay on mute if you can. I'm just hearing a little bit of interference. So I'll just try to keep an eye on that. So the current ecological crisis definitely drives my personal projects and work, my commitment to trying to play a more positive part, but it does feel like a big tangled mess, and it's very difficult sometimes to feel that we can play a part in unraveling it. What's that got to do with our demands? Well, the causes of the current ecological crisis are really extensive over-extraction of our planet's resources, or more importantly, taking the beautiful plants and animals and wrecking the joint in the name of a certain economic mode. But let's just talk a little bit about that so that we can think, well, why are we asking, how do we demand less of the living world? Well, that's because we have been demanding an awful lot of it lately. And I love this quote because it really shocked me, actually, back when I started my PhD. And this is was an old book when I did my PhD. But in 1992, Alan Durning in How Much Is Enough wrote, "Humans have consumed more resources since 1950 than in all previous human history put together." So let's just sit on that for a minute. 42 years, and that's back in 1992. We had used more resources than in all of previous human history. It's absolutely unimaginable. How did we get here? Now, normally I would show some graphs of the Great Acceleration. I have to confess, I couldn't find my graphs of the Great Acceleration, but maybe in discussion, I'll bring them up. How did we get here? Some people think it's all from neoliberalism. It's all from the sort of hyper-capitalism that's emerged, particularly since the 1980s, the Reagan, Thatcher, commodification of everything. Other people do point to this Great Acceleration. And the reason the graphs are important is after the Second World War, there was this terrible perfect storm of technological capacity and culture and mindset and corporate creation of a certain kind of capitalist version of overconsumption, so that when you look at these graphs, you see water extraction, forests, fishery, everything on this planet, all the graph lines go straight up. What we saw was this massive take. The victors from the Second World War, led by the US corporate and military industrial complex, had this technological capacity to just start really accelerating everything. And that's when we see, massive deterioration of plant and animal species across the globe on top of everything that had already come before it. So yeah, the graphs are normally much better than what I can explain. A lot of other people point to the European Industrial Revolution, and that suddenly the small scale use of coal that then turned into a massive extractivist activity starting in the UK and then moving around Europe. And then the Europeans colonizing other places and taking those ideas and modes of economic activity with them. But then other people, I know Mary Graham talks about the different governance systems that arose in societies that started to move from hunter-gatherer to large agricultural societies. And radical writers like Derek Jensen claim that since the Europeans particularly and the Middle East became agricultural societies, we completely changed our mode of interacting with Mother Nature. And all of these aspects, at whatever point you turn to, have contributed to how did we get here? Well, as someone who's a descendant of the Europeans and the British Empire who invaded this continent, how we got here was through thousands of years of extractivist capacity that then became extremely dangerous after the Second World War, where our technological capacity met with those ideas and enabled us to take out more of Mother Nature. Now, what can we do about it? This, of course, is the big question. And if I was in this workshop all by myself, I would spend most of the time talking about all the good things that can be done. But what I'd like to do, because I'm really keen to not be the only person in this workshop, is just flag a couple of ideas to think about. I like this cartoon, and it says, for those who can't quite read it, there's a man with a really weird gadget talking to two people, and he says, of course nobody needs one. That's why I called you advertising people in. So one of the things that I want to point to, and I'm going to do it by telling this story of this piece of work that Jeffrey Kaplan has done in his research, is point a little bit at the corporate creation of consumer society after the Second World War. So again, if we bring it back to the question for tonight, how do we shift from asking so much and taking so much? How do we change that kind of idea? Whether it's the ideas inside institutions, politics, culture, the economy, how do we take those ideas and change them? Well, it's very interesting to read about some of the early origins of consumer-based capitalism. And this article in Orion magazine, again, it's a couple of years old now, The Gospel of Consumption. I'm just going to tell a little story that he relays about two companies and why the corporate creation of the advertising industry, the corporate creation of making the consumers always want more, have been singularly critically important to the overtake that we've been experiencing since the 1950s, built on top of these other ideas. So in The Gospel of Consumption, Jeffrey Kaplan pulls out from the 1940s very public and easy to find memos, articles, journal articles written by CEOs of American corporations to show that they literally had a conversations that went something like this. Now that we can do good things in factories, we're actually making enough stuff in about 2 days a week to meet everybody's needs. Okay, well, that's great. Well, no, it's not great, because we're going to lose our position. We're going to lose our power. We're going to lose our income. So why don't we create endless desires? Why don't we create, through advertising and marketing, continually keeping the consumers dissatisfied? And the reason Jeffrey Kaplan writes about this is he points out to us is that if consumerism was created, not just a natural part of our human evolution, if it was deliberately created, then we can deliberately challenge it. And the story of two companies is one company around this time realized that they could be manufacturing and making stuff 3 or 4 days a week and let their staff work part-time. And this is in the 40s. And I'm not going to mention the companies. I want you to go and read the article. And what they were documenting, and it's in this article, is that suddenly people were happier and healthier. They were spending more time with their families. They were off together making jam and going on picnics. The flip side is another company that decided they actually wanted to make more and make more profits. And they not only kept their 5 days a week, but increased it. And the simple argument, the simple thing that he has highlighted is that we don't have to stay trapped in this mindset of endless production and consumption, and that consumerism has been created by creating dissatisfaction. And you've only got to watch adverts from Coca-Cola telling you that you really have to be young and beautiful to be part of this in and happy community, to really watch a car commercial if you have to, and watch, they actually feed off envy, where that someone's driving a cool car and they show people looking in awe at the car. They show people wanting more and needing more and thinking they have to change themselves. So that's really all I wanted to say about that. But I just wanted to point out that how we got here is a symptom of our culture, and very genuine needs. And the European Industrial Revolution came from, one bloke taking a weaving technique and just making it a bit better. They could make clothes a bit faster, and another bloke building a slightly different system and using steam to make food a bit differently. But it's all combined and it's all accelerated, and particularly this great acceleration in the 50s has damn near been our death knell. Now, how do we change things? How do we make this change? There's so many different opportunities and ways, regulatory, economic, etc. But all I wanted to point out, and then I'll definitely get out of here and hand over to Mary, is concepts like donut economics, which are becoming very popular. They're built on the ideas of steady state economics and beyond, are 21st century ideas for the West because they're actually focusing on planetary boundaries. So not only are we talking in abstract terms about steady state economics and limits, but they're actually focusing on what Western scientists are talking about as an ecological ceiling. But you can see that this itself is still a little bit European and Earth's human-centered. My big question for all of us is, how do we be human beings, but also leave room for the rest of the living world? And this is where people like Mary and Ross have really wonderful ideas, and I think some remarkable insights that are very worth listening to. Our program inside AILA, the Green Prince program, is doing lots of things to remind people that we're just one part of the living world, including changing the donut. We change the donut, so in fact this is a different version, but we normally have creating living space for the entire Earth community, and we talk about bioregional foundations and caring for country, as well as the bigger ideas around the planetary scale. So basic suggestions from Michelle Maloney and their work inside AILA and Nina and beyond has got a lot more wonderful ideas than this, but we have to build a new culture. We must understand our place in the living world, and that's what Earth jurisprudence and the relationist ethos and other ideas remind us. Accepting ecological limits, challenging extractivism, expansionism and growth. There's a ton of material out there on that. And remembering that we are basically human beings. We need to breathe in and out. We need water, we need food, and we need love. Beyond that, the rest of it's up to us. It's how we organise, how we govern ourselves, and how we create collective action. And if you're interested in any of the other work that we're up to, where we're trying to address a lot of these issues in one nifty program, do have a look at Green Prince. And finally, these are real posters from the Second World War, where we actually had governments encouraging people to decrease consumption. So these, I say here, modern history has examples of state-sponsored material frugality, because although I was pointing my finger at corporations, governments are in collusion with them and supporting this idea of endless growth. But there have been times in the past where even our pro-growth culture has told people that they should car share. When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. Join a car sharing club today. So yeah, I just wanted to show that because they're vaguely amusing and slightly terrifying. And thank you very much. That's my contribution to our yarn tonight. And if you've got any questions at all for any of us, please pop them in the chat and I'll put my facilitator hat back on now. So Mary, it's my great pleasure to introduce you. So Mary, would you like to now share with us some of your wonderful insights into these challenges that extreme extractivism have brought upon us? And sorry, Ross, I'll unspotlight you and me so that we can relax in the background and let Mary yarn.
Okay, well, very briefly, I'll just introduce myself as in Mary Graham. I was born in Brisbane, but I grew up here in my father's people's area on the Gold Coast. This is the Yugambeh language-speaking people down here. Different groups within that language group, and mine is Combameri. My mother was a Waka Waka person from the Burnett River district. She was under the Act, but my father wasn't under the Act, that Queensland legislation that made Aboriginal people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, tens of thousands of people we're talking about, like wards of the state. So they weren't free until they became exempted. They got exempted. In other words, were free from that legislation. So I've got relatives all over the southeast Queensland. But essentially, the name of it is medium. What's it called?
Medium expectations.
Expectations. Yeah. That's right.
And medium, you're the one who made that title up, and I love
it. Yes, and I forgot it.
How do you get some great expectations from medium?
Yeah. Yes, and another part of that, the other side of it is to aim for a moderate prosperity. You know, so if you want to be quite extreme about it, we can be. I think it's a good idea to ban billionaires. Actually, don't allow anybody to be a billionaire for a start, you know. So that might help a great deal. But I really wanted to basically in the first part talk about the difference between relationalism and survivalism. Relationalism is what a whole lot of Indigenous people have, including Aboriginal people, with the land, and the idea of the law of obligation that arose out of this relationship with land. The relationship comes out of us knowing or realizing, and it's all clear in the dreaming stories and so on, that we've been invented by the land. So even though there's thousands of Christians now, people who believe in a God, Aboriginal people, I mean, and some Muslims actually, by the way. But the old system, there's no idea of a God, no idea of a heaven or hell or anything like that. It's not in the thinking, it's not in the mind map of Aboriginal people to have such a kind of a gloomy kind of point of view where, which is essentially, like all religion and ideology, is a survivalist method, a mode of being in the world. Actually, you want to be safe. Of course, you want to be safe, you want to be looked after by some strong spirit figure, and that's what you end up doing. But our own old system is, no, you don't think in those terms, think in terms of the law of obligation. The land has invented us. This is how the argument goes. It's invented us, so we have to be forever obliged to land because it continues to look after us. It hasn't done its job and then forgotten about us. But I think in modern times, it has been forgotten about, of course, land. So it's just the background. It's the wallpaper that might make a whole lot of money for us and make some people very wealthy and powerful and so on and so on. And the awful thing is that leads to more wars and battles and competitiveness. So the competitive ethos is key part of the survivalist ethos. And from 10,000 years ago, from the beginning of large agriculture, that's exactly what's been happening. And it might come as a shock, but that's what's going on today, actually. It's really, people have been competing all the time about who controls resources. So you can go through all kinds of levels, time frames and so on and so on. But in the end, it's a fight between different powerful groups, powerful cultures, about who controls all of this. And some people really, really hate it. Some countries, we won't go into mentioning, but you probably already guessed, about, what do you call it? Rulers anyway, hegemonic rulers of the world, because what is all the things that were mentioned before, that Michelle mentioned before, they want all those things to keep going, actually. They want all those things to keep going, and the majority of the whole world's population doesn't want all that to be kept going. But people are sort of confused, though, too, I think, because they think the first thing they thought about, especially with this pandemic, it always stuck out to me, this idea of when are we going to get back to normal? And what's normal? Certain things are normal in certain places. In other places, countries around the world, things have not been normal for decades, maybe for centuries, because they've been colonized, and so on. They've been living in poverty for a long time because of imperialism and colonization. So back to the idea of relationalism and the relationalist ethos and the survivalism and the survivalist ethos, what Aboriginal people do or did with that idea is they use the relationalist ethos, a philosophy of relationalism, to counter survivalist tendencies. And that's what we have to do. You can do a whole lot of things about saving the environment, doing good things and so on. But the really hard thing to do is to change the governance system, the global governance system. And some people don't want to change that. They just simply they refuse to even countenance the idea of it might be changed. So but people really do have to be against it. So by all means, look after land, do all of that kind of thing, but have the right kind of governance system. And that means stop making war. That's what I would say. Have things like the moderate prosperity, but stop making war against the environment, stop making war against women, and stop making war against other countries, because they're all connected. They are all connected. And the things that get damaged badly in the middle of it all is, of course, as we know, is the environment, and of course, children, young people. Young people are very confused. And talking about consumption, yes, it is the whole story of consumption, but it's about the consumption of war too. The biggest thing one of the things that shocked me recently is not, various goods and so on, because that's shocking enough. But there are things you can buy for kids that are very praiseworthy of war games. They're being taught that war games is normal. Having war games, having hatred for other people who look different or are different live in other countries, it's normalized sort of behavior. So, and that's part of the consumerism too. So it's, by all means, look at the whole thing of the consumerism as in goods and material things and so on, but look at it in this other way though too. But start with the idea of the relationalist ethos, the law of obligation, and the survivalist ethos. So we're all survivalists and relationalists, but you have to start developing an actual philosophy of life, if you like, to counter the idea of the world is, everything is a survivalist kind of notion. And it isn't. You have to replace that with a relationalist idea. I mean, basically, that's all I wanted to really say here, because I really have been thinking deeply about this, that people have to get it in their heads that that's what you have to do. You can't just ignore the governance, because how are things going to change, actually? How are things going to change? Who's going to make those rules? You see, this is a brand new government, isn't it? Brand new government, and they're already fighting about whether or not, policies to do with the green policies and things like that. If they were modern thinking, and I reckon political parties in general, no matter how wonderful they do sound, or the policies that they come up with, and it does sound good, doesn't it, for Aboriginal people? It does. I'll rest my case about that though, and I don't want to talk about it basically. But I think people themselves have to take back power. Now that means Aboriginal people for Aboriginal affairs. We should run Aboriginal affairs essentially, and all people should, and especially women, should run the government, run the country in a quite balanced, equal ways with everybody else. Huge change has to come, and that's what I hear from very smart, very clever writers and thinkers, that the whole world needs a new global governance system, global government, and not fascism, not the what do you call it, international based rules, which we all know is a lie actually, and so on. You have to start looking after the country, but also in the middle of that, looking after your own sovereignty, the sovereignty of the self, you yourself. We're all autonomous beings. Women are definitely autonomous beings. That out there, the law, the land, it's autonomous too. It owns itself. It owns itself. And of course, we're seeing what happens when you ignore the fact that it owns itself. Everybody can see it, fires, floods, all over the whole world. And that's because the people who have been in charge, who are corporatocracy, call it what you like, plutocracies, who have basically enslaved governments to do what they want, So all this business keeps going on. But so all of that has to change. And some people, what are they called? They're protest people. The
Extinction Rebellion?
Extinction Rebellion. So people are getting more and more, especially young people, and that's wonderful, I think. They're getting more and more worried about things. And don't forget this, it's making young people very depressed. I think everybody thinks, oh, well, they mention it every now and then moving on right away to something else. They're all getting depressed because there doesn't seem to be any grown-ups running countries. And you need knowledgeable people. That's one thing that Aboriginal people did know. You have to have knowledgeable people who know how to run a country. And that means people with great experience, great knowledge, but also, above all, are principled, ethical people. I don't think there's any in the whole world today, basically, anybody, anywhere, you know, who know how to run a country. The quality, you know, the quality of the people who are calling themselves leaders and other people calling them leaders, you know, you wouldn't give them a job as a cleaner, you know, none of them. So women have to start fighting back, and especially fighting against war, because remember that war is being made all the time against women. You know, war is being made against people who don't agree with having their sovereignty taken over, and so on. And of course, we're fighting for that too in our own way. You know, fighting against the wars that are going on all the time against the environment and so on. So essentially, that's my idea of the relationalist ethos and the survivalist ethos. You know, go for relationalist ethos. Again, another thing I saw, just to finish with this, I was watching something on the news, a science person. He was talking about pandemics, and he was saying, everybody's heard of that word Anthropocene. Anthropocene, he's talking about that pandemics will become just normalized. They'll just become normalized. So what we're entering in is not just that Anthropocene, but it's he called it, I can't even pronounce it, something like a pandemic scene, pandemocene, or however you want to say it. So in other words, it's a whole world life full of that kind of thing. And the other thing he says that people really, really have to start working on a system, global governance and general, you know, assemblies, civil assemblies, people's assemblies and so on, of caring about one another and making it normalize that, taking into account and learning it in schools about the law of obligation. They have to do this. And he's talking not about a religious, this is a scientist. He's saying that's the rational, efficient thing to do. So, so to take care of all that kind of thing. And of course, while you're at it, just keep learning stuff from blackfellas about how to run a country, because they've been running a country for tens of thousands of years. They know how to run a country. They absolutely know it. So even though there's lots of, not lots, but there are some areas, some communities, you know, dysfunctionalism brought about by all the usual stuff that you know about, what you read about, but deeply, it has got the right idea about it, about how to run a country very carefully, you know, and caring about one another, you know, to look after each other, you know, look after the land. That's the training ground. Looking after land, then you know how to look after each other. So that's the training ground, though, looking after land. That's all. Then I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Mary. I know that everyone would like more from you, and we'll come back and have some questions and discussions in a moment. And someone actually asked, how can I hear more from Mary? Can I please suggest that you Google inside YouTube, Mary Graham? Mary has been prolific for decades in her work, and you'll find some really amazing talks by Mary on YouTube. You can also look on the AILA website under events, when we've had Mary as a guest speaker. Many of those talks are recorded, and also look on the Green Prince website. Mary has one particular talk she gave only a month or two ago about Aboriginal philosophy and the relationist ethos. It's a 1-hour lecture, and I really recommend it to you. It's a wonderful overview of many of the things that Mary is thinking about and working on. So, but Mary can tell you more herself when we come to Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, we'll come back in about 15 minutes and have another time for some Q&A. So, and Mary, I've already emailed you Zol's phone number.
Yes, I could see that. Thank you.
Good stuff.
Talk to you soon, Zol. Yeah, but probably not tonight. I've been on about 4 Zooms today.
Zoomed out.
I'm zoomed out. So I'll get in touch with you via email.
Lovely.
Thanks.
Thanks, Mary. I'm going to remove your spotlight. If you're a bit buggered, you can sit in the background now and relax.
Yes.
Thanks, Mary. And now Ross Williams, a friend of mine for 20 years, I think. So I was going to say many decades, but a couple of decades. But I'll let Ross, a wonderful colleague and thinker and worker, introduce himself. It's the Zombie apocalypse. Oh, that's fantastic, JP. It is a zombie apocalypse. Over to you, Ross.
Yeah, I agree with that. I feel like a bit of a zombie too. There's been so many of them, and I just don't know whether it becomes day or night these days. But hello, everybody. My name's Ross Williams. My traditional name is Chimmelbar, meaning lightning. I'm not so fast today, but thank you, Auntie Mary. I really love listening to you. And I too adapt my language and conversations around some of the things that Auntie Mary talks about as well as Michelle. I think it's really critical that, and we always are learning from each other every single moment. And that's the critical part. My traditional country is my traditional mob are Bindal from the Townsville to Burdekin River area on my father's side, on my mother's side from Arab, and Mer in the Torres Straits or the Eastern Islands. So I'm very proud of both my cultures, and equally they're very different from a cultural perspective as well. So I think it's really important that we learn a little bit about who we are as human beings. And I was looking at something the other day, and and there was this description made by this scientist, Camilla Pang, and she wrote, she's doing a series of webinars, but she wrote, humans are weird creatures. We obscure with obscure social customs, complex interpersonal relationships, and baffling unwritten rules. It's just amazing how she described human beings, is that we just this big mixed mash of ideas and suggestions, and we're so complex and so weird. No wonder we're in conflict with each other on a planetary basis. And unfortunately, I would have loved to, I think I can actually get access to one of her seminars, because I'd love to listen to her critique about human beings, you know. I really think that's really important. Auntie Mary mentioned about deep time, and I think one of the things with understanding how to listen to Mother Earth is really about how deep time works, and how we are a part of that deep time, and how we belong to the landscape. The importance about how we've been able to live. I think if we look at deep time, and we look at time in terms of Indigenous people on this continent, and we, there's an estimated about 60 to 80,000, some say 100,000. But Auntie Mary describes as that we became human here. And I like that analogy. I think that's the best type of analogy that can be adapted to the situation. And becoming human here means that we've had to learn to adapt to the landscape, to the changing environment. Now, if you take that in deep time, and deep time means a lot further than that, obviously, but in this little shadow of a moment in time, we have made and adapted extraordinarily well to our landscape without destroying it, without what we did was manipulate some of our environment to suit ourselves using fire management. But fire is a technique of management, but didn't harm the environment, didn't harm animals, species, plants. The earth allows itself to do that. We just adapted to that over those thousands and thousands of generations. So we got to understand exactly what that meant. And so we didn't become so destructive about the way we operate. And we're able to adapt very well. And now you bring that, 80,000 years to roughly 230 years ago. Look at the destruction that has occurred already on this continent in that various marginal space of time. And that time has really disrupted the whole continent, and therefore the globe as well. And Auntie Mary did mention and talked about the global impact. And look, unless you're living under a rock somewhere, then you're ignoring what's happening globally across this whole planet, and in the shift in our climate, and human-induced climate change, an accelerated human-induced climate change, which is really majorly impacting, even so right down to how we interact to our environment here in Australia, into our own streets and around the places we work in and so forth. I mean, the COVID pandemic changed the way birds were really started to come on in the last couple of years, and I love it. You know, some neighbours don't like it because the cockatoos are destroying some of their, you know, plants and some of the background, some of their little things around their places as well. But the bird life has changed. But now I've seen that little spiders and little creatures are no longer in existence, even around my place. That has changed. So if you watch your environment, you can see things happening all the time. You can hear it, you can see it, you can smell it. And that's how we operate as an Indigenous peoples. And we certainly see the world in a different way. And we obviously see the world through those generational thousands and thousands of years of time. And we've been able to adapt to it. Are we stressed about the way the planet is, or this continent is being destroyed? Absolutely. And we have this long-standing contract with our continent, with our environment. And that contract is written in the way we behave through law. That contract is the longest standing contract on this planet. And that's 80,000-year contract. It's a written contract in law. And it's the law of obligation, as Auntie Mary talked about. So you show me anybody that has a contract that extends over 80,000 years, and I'll tell you that they don't exist. It's as simple as that. So our law of obligation is our contract. If we don't have that contract, we don't manage that contract, we don't protect that contract, we then become invalid. And our environment gets disrupted as it is now. Auntie Mary talked about some mob now using land as a commodity rather than as a shelter. And that's right. But there are a lot of other people too that use land as a place, as a heart, as a home, because that's what it is. It protects us. It provides for us. And we still, even in today, we have to adapt to some of those changes, as horrible as they may be. And then people will say, well, we have to live. Well, there's a whole variety of different ways you can live without destroying your country. You know, measure it in that time frame, the deep time frame itself. And the landscape looks after you if you know how to look after the landscape. We're looking for shortcuts, and we continue as a planet and as human beings to look for these shortcuts. We are self-destructing. We are destroying ourselves. And the reality is we don't have dominion over the landscape. We don't have dominion over the land. You know, we've got to be able to adapt to that process. Indigenous people were really good at that. We're able to, mind map the whole landscape. We're able to know where the birds were, what the plants were doing, what the microbes were doing, where the water was going to fall, where the rivers are, what the trees were doing. We were able to measure that in subtle climate changes around. We would have 6, 7 different sort of seasons rather than the old the European 4-year seasons. There's this adaptation. There's subtle changes within the environment that we can pick up on very, very, very quickly. And we can tell you exactly what's going to happen into the future. And the dynamics of what happens into the future around our planet and what's happening, we already spoke about this 30, 40 years ago. We knew this was coming, and it's here and it's starting. And scientists talked about the tipping point. I can tell you now, I spoke to a lot of elders and they said, my boy, trouble is coming. These people are destroying our country. Time will come when Mother Nature will seek her equivalent back, and say, well, the tipping point. And I never quite understood what they meant, but scientifically they put it into the tipping point. And as soon as I heard about the tipping point, bang. That tipping point we reached a while ago from an environmental point of view. And we've got to look at it not just in terms of here and what we can do, but we got to look at what we do here in a global context. And what we see in the global context is horrible. We have populations, millions and millions of people moving because of the environmental impacts. The weather is massively changing. If people watch what's happening in the Northern Hemisphere with the floods, massive amounts of water, drought, an extreme drought, extreme heat. What does that tell you? Something is going wrong. What is going wrong? We don't ask ourselves enough deep questions to figure out the solutions. Auntie Mary talked about, it's like the ladies, a lady I saw in a program of the Haida Gwaii off the Canadian coast, and she said, you build all your buildings and you have all these shrines to yourselves. She was talking about, non-indigenous people. You want to, bow down to these sacred sites, these churches and these bridges and all that sort of stuff. But we bow down to nature. Nature provides us. She provides us the beautiful rivers, the beautiful creeks, the beautiful fish, the beautiful birds in the sky, the beautiful trees. That's a continuation of what gift is given to us, what Mother Nature gives to us. She said, don't worry about what man can give to you, because it becomes self-destructive and ownership rather than obligation. And I just love the way she critiqued how she said, we are wanting to commit to and continue to commit to our obligation of handing the next generations what was gifted to us. And that's the beauty of the environment. And the less destruction we can provide to that environment, the better off we're going to be. And we as humans have really got to start to, particularly in Australia, we've got to start understanding we've been educated, manipulated, and designed to think a certain way. Think about how you've been taught to think. Unpack all that. Listen, take advice, take information, and repack what you think you ought to know. And once you do that, you start to see yourself in the environment. You see yourself as a part of the planetary process, because we've got to stop taking away and killing off our inheritance for our children's children. That's the destruction that I'm talking about. What are we going to leave them? I don't want to know the legacy that I'm going to leave my grandkids, because I'm going to try my hardest, and I do try my hardest to do my best, but it's a heavy lifting game for all of us. And but I can teach them cultural ways and doing things culturally in a meaningful way, not to overtake, not to be so greedy that it becomes all consuming. So it's about how do we self-adapt into our environment. Is it possible? I'd like to think so, because for me, the only thing that I always have in my mind is that hope is the last thing that dies, no matter what. Thank you.
Thank you, Ross. People are doing air claps. I think they love that. That's beautiful. Thank you. So I'm just going to put the spotlight back on Mary, and I'll come into, we have a couple of questions. Oh, that's nice. Someone has called us. She said, Mary has said, thanks so much, you magnificent three. Isn't that nice?
That's
Instead
lovely.
of the magnificent seven, we should be
Yeah, no, magnificent seven. There might be.
Excellent. There's a couple of questions that have come in on the main thingy and then privately to me. So I'll just ask a couple of questions to Mary and Ross, and if anything's relevant, to me as well. Stacey has asked, I wonder if our faith in the concept of democracy is holding us up. Auntie Mary, is democracy actually the best way? Sociocracy is worth a look. Mary, do you want to talk a bit about, you've got a lot of ideas about this and consensus and democracy versus, do you want to have a chat about that?
You might regret asking me that.
Mary has very particular ideas.
I have particular ideas about democracy.
Go for it.
Just to let you know, when before a couple years ago, the ATSIC, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, was just swept away by the government. All these different policies that blackfellas make up usually get swept away. So the blackfellas at the time, really good fellas, who are involved now in the Uluru Statement and that too, were setting about to set up, starting to organise setting up the National Congress. But before they did that, they thought, well, they'd better ask people around the whole country, Aboriginal people, what they think about it. And above all, what kind of system do you want? And so this is interviews, all kinds of research for about a year or so, I think. But some of the answers came back was very kind of surprising, not so surprising to most blackfellas. But one question was about having a system. Do we want a system like ATSIC? See, ATSIC was the first example or experiment with whitefellas trying to teach the benefits of democracy to people. Well, the answer back from that was no. This is like something like between 70 and 80% of the people said, no, we don't want anything like ATSIC. In other words, we don't want democracy, because they had an experience with it. First and last time they wanted it, because for the obvious reason, not an ideological reasoning either. Look, we've run a country. We know how to run things. We'll have our own system back. Thank you very much. The system of consensus. So people, so Aboriginal people can run their own affairs, not through democracy at all. And I don't often say this because I only remembered it not long ago, is that one person we're discussing it all, and they were saying something like, this democracy, it's a bit like gambling, isn't it? You're gambling that the person who has put themselves forward to be voted on or in is a good person, is a principled person, and so on and so on. But you don't know that for sure at all. And half the time, 70% of the time, it doesn't work out like that at all, because that person is under the thumb of the policies of a party and so on. Anyway, we had a good talk about it, and I thought, yeah, that's right too. It's like a gamble. So you have to go back to the local, really, the local. And what impressed me just recently, without going into the whole discussion about ideologies and that, because Western political scientist people, all that, they know the weaknesses of democracy. They know it has, and usually somebody ends up quoting them about what old Churchill says. Yes, it's a terrible system, except for all the others, recently what I was very impressed with is that a lot of people, Western people, are sick and tired of the lies that the promises that democracy holds out for people. And so some people have decided to try to bring about a movement that is of their own making, and it's called sortition, actually, the proper Greek word for it, sortition, and that means citizens' assemblies or people's assemblies. So democracy on the ground in their region. So, for example, it might be, how you have jury duties? Well, this might be a group of people, 100 or so, a couple of hundred maybe, chosen like that randomly. And that becomes a citizens' assemblies and so on and so on. And somebody told me the other day, actually, I think it's, is it in Ireland or one particular country anyway, where they always have citizens' assemblies to discuss things, and that goes to the government, But I thought that's a really good sign, because if you want to, I often compare democracy to this a bus, a big vehicle, and the bus is wonderful and shiny in the front of it. It's very handsome, very well designed and so on. And so people enter the bus through the door in the front. So you're part of the whole voting system and so on and so on. So you go in, so the first part of the bus, maybe it's broken up into 3 compartments or 4 maybe. It's very nice, very well appointed, you know, very suitable and so on. But you go further down that aisle, further down, and the worse it gets. So that right at the end of the bus, here are all these poor bastards. That's where the most of the people are. And there's no back to this bus. It's open, completely open. So people fall out of it. You know, it's unsafe and so on. So that's a kind of democracy that that the West praises. It seems to be. It seems to be. So you have, you know, the best democracies in the world, and they are populated with millions and millions of people who are poverty-stricken, homeless, have no health, you know, and this is all in a great free country like with democracy. So I would say myself, my own idea is to have some other kind of system. Definitely got to be a certain amount of socialism there, definitely. I suppose I'm, you know, I'm culturally and politically very Aboriginal, but I'm part of it is being socialist too. For example, as I said before, billionaires would cease to be existent. That would be outlawed straight away. Nobody's allowed to be that. And there'd be no more, say, salaries where there's not just a difference between the basic salary and 3 or 4 times more. Instead of having that would be okay, but not a gap of about almost 100%, like 10 or 100 times more than the basic wage. You know, that would be outlawed completely. So no more room for wealthy, powerful people who run governments and of course steer democracy, you know, and we know, everybody knows that's what goes on. Everybody knows that's what real democracy means. And no, so sorry, Laurie, whoever asked that. That's what I think of democracy.
No, I think that's what she asked it actually, and she's Mary.
But I do like the idea of the you know, real on the ground democracy, like citizens' assemblies. That's real. You know, it's very akin, Ross, to consensus, our own old style. See, that's the best thing. Nobody gets left out. You have everybody there.
Yep.
You know.
And Mary, Stacey went on to ask about sociocracy, which is a different form of, you know, groups connected. So you have a circle of folks making decisions, and then what their decision is come to the next level up, where you've got folks all intersecting. Have you ever looked at that approach or thought much about it?
Actually, no, I don't. But I'll tell you who that system is very familiar to. If you want to learn more about it, that's the Chinese system. That's the Chinese version of democracy. That's exactly what it is. You have different levels of people. And that's how come you end up with, of course, a one-party state, of course, but a civilized, I would say, a civilized state. You can say, all right, you can say it's totalitarian and a one-party state, but keep in mind that somebody once said, yes, it's a one-party state, but they've been a one-party state for about 2,000 years. You realise that, don't you? You know, so they've run the country too for a very long time, thousands of years. But you know, when they bailed out hundreds and hundreds of millions of people out of dire poverty. Now that's a very odd thing for a totalitarian country to do, don't you think? You know, but that's that political system. They have to look after the people first, all the people, get them out of poverty, put them into housing, because there were hundreds of millions of people living in terrible poverty. And that's what they've done over about 20 years. And most people, economists and all that, they know it. They know that, you know, it's one of the most miraculous things for a long time. You know?
Thanks, Mary. So a question for both of you from me, which is, can we talk a little bit about how the relationist ethos and its deep consideration of non-human life and life supporting systems, you know, has really, I think, informed Aboriginal ways of connecting with place, but also limiting human arrogance and limiting human hubris or take from Mother Earth. Could you talk a little bit more about that, Mary? And then Ross, your comments would be welcome too.
I'd really like to ask Ross, would you mind answering it? Because I'm just thinking about, I'm always reminded of you and what you and Barry and other people say about the value, spiritual value too, but practical, pragmatism, practical value of fire. That's just one thing. it's only one thing, you know, fire, and how it is used to look after people. You mightn't think that, you know, considering those terrible fires down there, but there were other reasons for that, Ross? You know, because they didn't look after land. What do you
They didn't
say?
look after country, and they didn't look
Yeah,
after
they didn't look
fire.
after country. That's
Yeah.
right. They didn't. They certainly didn't. You
No.
know. So, and that's why all that happened. You know?
Okay.
Yeah, and you're right, Arnie. It's about people often see, well, European people see fire as this enemy,
yeah,
you know, and as this
It's
devil,
not.
as this evil.
Mm.
The way we see fire and adapt fire is that it's our friend. If you look at and use fire as a friend, it actually becomes a very that we become a relationist with fire as well.
That's
and
right.
fire in the right place, in the right time, the right seasons, using the right trees, making sure that your environment is adapted. You adapt the fire to the environment. You will actually work out that fire will be and can be your best friend. And even in those really bad fires down south, and they call it, you know, Black Ash Wednesday or something like that, Black Saturday or something. Hello, don't give it a colour, you know, please. You've ignited the bush. You've let the bush get to that point where it's just ignited and gone up. Now, I can tell you that there've been people inside that lived inside those firestorms that did fire adaptations through cultural burning that completely survived. Their properties survived. Their animals survived. We still haven't learned a damn thing about how to utilize fire as a friend. It is a beautiful thing, and when you're using fire, the less smoke that you have, the better the fire is. And when you animals will be aware, you know, and you're not burning out your organisms underneath the soil. You're not drying your soil. You're not killing all the stuff that needs to adapt to fire. And still, the firefighters use this as a principle. Oh, we've got to do, you know, back burning, or we've got to do this. Start thinking about using fire as an adaptive mechanism to be able to protect your environment. And again, and even when we've got trees, you know, we've got those big gums down there where the bushfires were. They were too close. They should never have been that. When Indigenous people down there were adapting to using fire, all that landscape, there was about roughly 10 meters between each tree. And when you had those flames rising really high and just jumping from tree to tree and then going further and further away, the canopy fires, it was absolutely ludicrous. So we've got to be able to adapt the way management is and fire. Look, we're not always going to get it right, but if we learn what our country needs, we can then self-adapt to the country's needs. And I can tell you, I've spent time with fire practitioners, and it's just a beautiful process. You can walk through a fire. You know, you walk inside a fire. It just clears away. If you burn it correctly and you do it a mosaic way, your animals know exactly where to go, where to leave, what their exit points are, and so you're not burning the hell out of trees and you're not ripping through the canopies. If we learn those behaviors and we learn to adapt and use fire as a friend and not as a foe, we won't even need you know, the massive firefighters. You know, they just go for house fires rather than big bushfires. National parks, protected areas, they all got to learn how to do this stuff. They still ignore it. It's that monocultured behavioral technique that they use. Oh, fire is the enemy. We've got to, you know, burn this stuff when it becomes heavily laden. But anyway, I could go on for ages about fire and
that's just one area, eh?
It's
just one area. Fire.
Absolutely,
there's heaps of things to do with the environment. Heaps
of
things,
and water. You know, water is critical to how we understand country as well. And and the destruction of using water for dams and things like that.
Yes.
And they don't see anything. I just, it frustrates me to no end to say, well, you know, it's just easy to build these things and, you know, and create a massive amount of want. And we're creating food and waste like it's going pathetically
waste.
out of fashion. I mean, why should we be
It's cruel.
growing crops and feeding 80 million people? You know, we're not using our common sense. We're trying to use the economy, getting involved in the economy. We're making stuff, building stuff. We're
you have to have a common
picking
sense
up stuff to sell it off. It's about money and greed.
Yeah.
So anyway, sorry about that.
I think no, don't be sorry. That's what we're here for. We're here to have a young one. Ross and Mary, there's actually a nice question here that's something that all three of us can talk about. So let me just read the question and then I'll frame to you. Let me just see. So the question is from Supriya. Caring and being part of nature seems to be such a natural, simple way of being. How did humans come so far away from being their natural selves? With reference to Michelle's slide regarding industrial and agricultural causes, how did these overcome something so innate in humans? So what I'd like to do is start as the non-indigenous with my own analysis, but then I'd love for Ross and Mary to either challenge me in what I'm saying or share insights from your own cultural point of view that really show the contrast. So I am somewhat of a nerdy hobbyist historian, and it has really helped me inform my thinking about this, because I ask this question all the time. I'll be honest, I've often literally lie in bed going, how the heck did my people, the Europeans, end up being the destroyers of a planet? What happened to us that took us away from loving place or loving the earth enough to look after it? The questions are bigger and nothing is simple, right? But when you look at history, and Mary and I have talked about this, when you look at even the Bronze Age in Europe, tribes were already, and even pre large-scale agriculture, tribes across Europe were already, they were still pagan, they weren't Christian. They had allegedly multiple gods. In some places, no one can prove that. And although they would, many different folks, and I can speak for the work I've looked at in Britain, many folks would honor the rivers and honor the waters. And so they looked to the environment as sacred. They were still already, in some places, patriarchal, hierarchical, and were starting to become farmers. And even pre-farming, there was tribalism, slavery, changing and terraforming the earth. So they weren't just hunter-gatherers, but they weren't even pre-large-scale agriculture. They were starting to be terraformers. So there seems to be two things going on in the early times of the European mindset. One is that constant fighting, and I think Mary can say something about that, the survivalist ethos where people were invading each other and stealing their lands. And, you know, I've seen documentaries about archaeological digs, and slavery in Britain is a lot earlier than you'd think. They were selling their own people to the Romans before the Romans invaded. So this is pre-Christian and pre the birth of Christ. So there was already a mindset of control and domination, which is very different to what I would see the relationist ethos as being. And for what it was, the pagan ideas, or, you know, throwing your sword in the river to honor the river gods or the whatever, it didn't translate into seeing plants and animals as sacred relatives, because they were still cutting down forests and using up resources. So something happened in that European mindset. And the thing to remember is then it escalated. And when you look at, and I'm sorry to rave, but when you look at the consolidation of centralized power in Anglo-Saxon times, just before the Norman invasion in 1066, which saw the big towers and the beginnings of England,
castles.
The Anglo-Saxons, Wessex and Sussex, they were all trying to consolidate power, and the endless effort to consolidate power. And this is in such a contrast, isn't it, Mary, to the governance system in Indigenous Australia, where everyone was their own autonomous community, and there was no overriding effort. And it's funny because you read it in commentary still today, and the Aboriginal people didn't consolidate to centralized state power, as if it's a bad thing. Anyway,
yeah,
to me,
a
there's
failing on our part.
yes, and I'll
We're
stop in
slack.
a minute and let you talk. But from my view, when I look at my people, they were interconnected with folks from across the Middle East and into Asia and into Africa. And I think that endless movement of people opened them up to, well, we're running out of stuff, let's invade them. And Mary has commented often on the isolation of Aboriginal people, but they could have done that to each other. And at some point they didn't. So there's that. There's the lack of sacralized relationship with plants and animals. They used them, they respected them, but they didn't say brother badger. Yeah. And
not until that saint comes along.
And then really what we saw was that endless consolidation of hierarchical power, which comes into that 1500s, where they then build big enough boats to tootle off and start invading other people. And by then they've had Christianity for many hundreds of years, or 1,000 years, and are absolutely imbued in treating any non-Christian as if you're an animal, you're a heathen.
Yes.
So that expansionism, extractivism, racism, superiority, these things were embedded in the European mindset by the 1500s, and that's when they all started to wander off and take those ideas to other parts of the world. So how did we become so separate? A long stepwise evolution of ideas, to the point where the folks who came to Australia in 1788 were completely separate from any, they were absolutely anthropocentric, patriarchal. Women were property, women couldn't vote. Aboriginal people were animals and heathens. Anyone who wasn't a Christian didn't matter. And everything was a resource to be used. The end.
Everything and everybody, really.
Everything and everybody.
They were a resource too, of course, slavery. But that's been around for a very long time, eh?
Yes. So do you guys want to reflect on, I mean, and I'm not bagging everything about my
No.
When you dig into things like the Industrial Revolution, those little steps forward were because people they had a famine and they wanted to do something better so that people could survive. You know, it wasn't with this intent of, in 500 years, we will destroy the planet. Huzzah.
No, it wasn't all a planned thing like that.
No, but I reckon fellas got clever early and how to live there and didn't wreck the joint.
Well, I know it's not the only thing. There are a whole lot of other offshoots of all of those arguments. But one thing that you could say, it's fated. This is a great big island continent. Apparently, the whole of Europe could fit comfortably inside of this Australia if it suddenly got placed here. But the fact that across all those other countries, other, what do you call them, lands, they're all connected up with each other. So when things happened way back, either man-made conflicts or natural conflicts like famines, pandemic, they were probably there too, natural in the weather, kind of climate change, all that. It was easier for the survivalist ethos to come to the fore, for people to believe that the whole world is a dangerous place, that everybody, especially people you don't know, and maybe people you do know, your neighbours, anybody, is always a potential enemy. In fact, the land itself is a potential enemy and has got to be brought under control and so on. So it tells me that really the very idea of having that kind of logic, either or, all the Aristotelian logic, it's no wonder if you're used to having battles all the time, that there's always somebody looking to kill you or to take things away from you, chasing you one from left, right, and centre. You will end up with that kind of logic, with that kind of the world is a dangerous place. So we just happen to be in a great big island continent where none of that happened. Now you could say that how come it didn't happen? The only other people who used to come to the place, and it's a good relationship with the trade, trade with different Asian groups from the north, coming and going. About 15, 16, 1700 years, nearly 2,000 years they were doing that. They didn't try to take it over. So the concept of invasion, the concept of it, is not even here. It wasn't even here. The concept of, and the activity, of course, of conflict is definitely here. You can read some dreaming stories. They're all about this mob is fighting with that mob, and this mob is doing the wrong thing, and so on, so on. So there's every different word in all the different languages, including Yugambeh here. There's a word for war, would you believe? There's words for kill, attack, revenge, feuds, everything you can, duels, you can think of every word to do with conflict is there, but not the word for invade. There's no equivalent of that word because it's a foreign concept. And that figures, doesn't it? Because if you've never been invaded and you're not used to doing that with each other, you've already laid down rules, not just law of obligation, but all that kind of thing, that land is a sacred thing. It's a sacred thing. So you can't be drawing that into wars with ownership, wars, invasion. So invade, conquest, subjugate the people by taking over their land. And you can see that in the language group, the language map. You see all those different places. The invader, wherever the invader is, always forces the invaded to speak their language of the invader. So if that had happened here, there would be fewer language groups in the country. There's hundreds of them, there would have ended up being maybe a big country like this, a dozen maybe, great big tribes, great big area regions, and so on, but there isn't. They kept their own sovereignty, their own, and so on. So you could have a fight if you don't like your, if you can, don't like your neighbour or your relatives or anything. You're quite free to have a big fight with them, but don't go around invading their space, essentially. Whereas practically everybody else, every other continent, they had to put up with all of that, not just man-made war, battles, revolutions, everything. People want to take over your land, but natural things like what do you call it? Starving to death, famines, famines, pandemics, and all that. So somebody somewhere at some point over all these tens of thousands of years, 20,000 maybe, somebody is running away from other people, trying to be safe, trying to look for that. And that's one thing that never sort of, more or less, you can't really say for it definitely because you don't know, but it seems as if that didn't happen here. You simply couldn't do that. This is a country of, the word multipolar. There's unipolarity, which is an empire. Bipolarity, bipolar sounds funny actually, but yeah. A bipolarity system is two great big powers, the USSR, US fighting with each other for power, and then there's a multipolarity system, and that's what a lot of people are going for now. They're sick and tired of ruling hegemons trying to own the whole world and own all the resources in the world, control them, every different group in this country, a big country, a big mob, a large region, all different sizes and wealth, as in the richness of the country. Like here in the Gold Coast, didn't want for anything, but if you're living way out in the desert, God, things are far apart. That's why they look like big groups, but it's not because of population, it's because they have to go further for resources and so on. That's why they needed all that space, So the ones who had less didn't decide to go and attack the ones who had a great deal, the best water and the best hunting. They just simply couldn't, because the land has invented them and it's invented us too, the potential invaded, You simply can't go that far. So they end up with a different logic, and so you can't. I'm not letting colonialism and imperialism off the hook, but I'm saying that it's understandable logically why they would end up thinking that invasion is normal. But
it's interesting.
We don't,
because even the Dutch and the Spanish have visited this continent, and they've there's artwork and there's a lot of different things that indicated the Macassans were one of our biggest traders in the north.
Yes,
a lot of those mobs. So, invasion wasn't it? It was trade. It was bartering.
Trade. That's a good relationship.
Bartering is one of the best relationships you could have.
But Ross, the relationship with the Macassans was apparently, from everything you read, very healthy, because they understood they came, they traded, they left.
Absolutely.
The Portuguese, the Dutch, who scooted around the western side of Australia, they weren't being good people just trading. They spotted Australia's coastline and thought it wasn't worth invading.
That's not what you're saying, though. Is that what you're saying? No, you weren't
no.
saying that.
But and then
Sorry.
some of the shipwrecks were there, and then you know, they died over there as well. You know, so
Yeah.
different circumstances, different situations. But I think incrementally, you know, with the invention of boats and everything else that come along, and sails, and people started moving around the planet, and then you have power, you know, different, and the purpose of power, and then you had kings, and then you had all that power associated with that, and then you had religion to profoundly sort of put
Monotheism,
together things that
Yes.
rules that you could allow for your invasion. Your justification for killing people was, if they weren't Christians, then therefore you were allowed to kill them, and God would forgive you. And this was very pervasive and very incremental. And so, and as we've gone along, the rules have changed to suit the person in power. And this is where we're at now. The person with the power uses it in a way that it is fear. You know, and not only is it fear, it's force to start with, and then it's fear is the second mechanism. So force is to either bow to their will, or and once you do that, either by gun, by whatever means is necessary, and you know, these critiques, and then using fear to suppress.
And it's really interesting, you talking about the combination of things, you know, and we'll wrap up in a minute, folks, but I think we could all sit here and gossip about history and impacts forever, actually. But something that is very dominant in the European story is that with the rise of Christianity, you saw the Roman Empire started to shift and change before it allegedly collapsed. But when the Roman Empire's power across Europe shifted, it was replaced with the monotheism of Christianity and the power of Rome as the church. So fear and power and hierarchy is not a new idea. I'm not saying you're saying this, anyone, but it's not a new idea. That hierarchical stuff, and you think about it, the kings and queens of the day told people they were the voice of God, and they were way more important than anybody else. So the hierarchical structure wasn't just corruption, it was an entire cultural belief that they were worth more important. I mean, I find that bizarre, but anyway.
Well, that's where it's come to. There's got to be, people are saying there's got to be a new global governance system. There has to be. Otherwise, the whole thing is just going to implode. Implode
well,
completely.
I have to say,
whistle out of nuclear stuff.
Yeah, even since, like, at my age, what I would see across the planet in the 80s is very different to today. If we're closer to a rising ecological consciousness as a species now than we've ever been in the last 100 years. I mean, that's a dumb thing to say, but also a general thing to say. You know what I mean? Like, we're seeing the rise of such concern about the harm we've caused that people are starting to shift. So,
But I would repeat, that's all I'd say, is that you've got to be against war, because it's going on all the time. It's and I know we're talking about the Earth laws and so on, but you've got to be against them.
of course,
Making war on women, making war on the land, you know, and making war against other people, you know, other countries, you know. Don't be on the side of a hierarchy, you know, of any sort.
Look,
but you know, that's a great thing, you know, Artie, and we've got to, I don't know, I seriously have some serious reservations. We're just warring with each other continuously. It's a continuous momentum. Particularly, we're not quite sure why it happens the way it does. But we've certainly got to, as human beings, got to start challenging it, because we're not only warring against each other, we're warring against the environment.
Yes.
And Ross, I thought you were saying we were boring, but I don't know.
Oh, no.
Well, it could have been that
my
too.
lack of teeth.
I definitely think some of my patriarchal male white ancestors were pretty boring when I see some of the things they've built and created. Hey, look, lovely ladies and gentlemen, it's time to wrap up, but I wanted to give a plug for a number of awesome events coming up literally in the next 2 weeks. So on Saturday, we three, as Future Dreaming, are hosting one of our, we've been having them every 2 months or so in the middle of the year, last year and this year, throughout the middle of the year. So this Saturday at 12 noon, we've got our Connecting to Place, Caring for Country workshop. unlike this one, which has been free, we do charge for that one because it forges a bit of an income for those of us who are all scrounging for an income in amongst the work. So if you'd like to join us, let us know. If you're really broke and you want to join us anyway, let us know. We're very, very inclusive. We let folks come in and join us no matter what's going on. And I think I wanted to mention, that's the inside, that's the back end of. So if you look at the Earth Laws program, and I'll put the link in, next week, we've got some really cool events too. So Tuesday night, Regen Songlines, which includes the wonderful Mary Graham and Ross Williams. It's an Indigenous-led regenerative forum or network. And from, I think, again, it's 6:30 to 8. There's going to be a discussion about sustainability, regeneration, and caring for country. It's going to include Tyson Yonka-Porter. Anne Polina probably can't join us, but she's part of Songlines, and a number of other folks really looking at this regenerative movement and taking some Indigenous perspectives on what needs to be done if we're going to take it seriously and do it well. And then there's actually Future Dreaming is hosting a wonderful webinar with Victor Stephenson about Indigenous fire management on the 26th.
Oh, great.
So
Good.
yeah, we've got a number of cool things happening. And do look up our websites and past events if you want to have a listen to any of us talking, because we've tried to record lots of them. But on that note, I will put in the link for Earth Laws Month. Actually, it's above my head. It has been for nearly an hour and a half. earthlaws.org.au/ELM 2022. And you will see our cute little calendar, and you'll get blasted with about 35 events that we're hosting throughout September. But please do join us. Zol is saying thank you with
okay.
So
And I'll
hey.
get in touch with you, Zol, in a couple of days. Okay.
Yep. You've got your number now.
Yep.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, everyone.
Everybody.
Really appreciate it.
Over and out for this evening, anyway.
Over and out, baby.
All right.
Time to not be a zombie anymore.
Nice to meet you, Ross.
You too. Wonderful to meet all of you. Thank you.
Good night, everybody. Take care.